Jake Morrison had always been the type of guy who thought rules were more like suggestions. The 28-year-old American tourist stood outside Buckingham Palace on a crisp London morning, his phone already recording as he eyed the stoic King's Guard standing motionless at his post. The red-uniformed soldier held his rifle at attention, his famous bearskin hat towering above his head, eyes fixed straight ahead as hundreds of tourists snapped photos around him. "This is going to be epic," Jake whispered to his college buddy Mark, who was visiting London with him. "I bet I can get this guy to break character. These guards are supposed to be like robots, right? Let's see how robotic he really is." Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the growing crowd of tourists. "Dude, maybe we shouldn't mess with him. These guys are actual soldiers, not theme park actors." But Jake was already approaching the guard, his phone held high to capture every moment. He had over 50,000 followers on social media, and this video could easily go viral if he played it right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Jake positioned himself just a few feet from the guard. The soldier, whose name tag read Guardsman Williams, remained perfectly still. His face showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of Jake's presence. He had been standing at this post for 2 hours already, and his training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Tourists tried to get reactions from the King's Guard every single day. Jake started small, waving his hand in front of the guard's face. "Hello, anyone home in there?" He laughed, turning to his phone camera. "Guys, I'm here at Buckingham Palace, and I'm about to see if I can crack this royal robot." The guard's breathing remained steady and controlled. His grip on his rifle never wavered. Years of military training had taught him to maintain discipline no matter what distractions came his way. He had dealt with tourists trying to take selfies with him, people making funny faces, and even some who had attempted to touch his uniform or rifle. Encouraged by the lack of response, Jake grew bolder. He began doing jumping jacks beside the guard, then started making exaggerated facial expressions. "Come on, man." Not even a smile. "This is the friendliest American you'll ever meet." Other tourists began gathering around, some laughing at Jake's antics while others looked disapproving. A few elderly British visitors shook their heads in disgust, muttering about disrespectful Americans. The crowd was growing larger by the minute, with people pulling out their own phones to record what was becoming quite a spectacle. Mark tugged at Jake's sleeve. "Seriously, let's just go. You're making a scene and not in a good way." But Jake was feeding off the attention now. He had already imagined the comments and likes flooding in when he posted this video. His followers loved when he pushed boundaries and did things others wouldn't dare to do. This was exactly the kind of content that had built his social media presence. "Watch this," Jake announced to his phone, then to the growing crowd. He stepped even closer to the guard, now standing just inches away from the soldier's polished black boots. The guard's eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere in the distance, his expression unchanged. Guardsman Williams had been serving in the King's Guard for 3 years. He had protected members of the royal family, participated in state ceremonies, and served with distinction. He took immense pride in his role and the traditions he represented. Every day he put on the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, knowing that he was part of something much larger than himself. The morning air was filled with the sounds of London traffic and tourist chatter, but Williams had learned to block out all distractions. His focus was absolute, his commitment unwavering. He represented not just himself but his regiment, his country, and centuries of military tradition. Jake began narrating for his video audience. "So apparently these guys are supposed to be the toughest soldiers in Britain. They guard the king and all that royal stuff. But look at this, I'm literally right in his face and he can't even blink." He gestured dramatically, his voice getting louder and more animated. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people now. Some tourists were taking pictures of Jake rather than the guard, seemingly more interested in the Americans' antics than the traditional ceremony they had come to witness. Children pointed and giggled while their parents tried to quiet them down. An elderly woman with a thick British accent spoke up from the crowd. "Young man, that's quite enough. Show some respect." Jake turned to her with a grin. "Relax, Grandma. I'm not hurting anyone, just having a bit of fun with our statue friend here." He gestured toward the guard, who continued to maintain his position despite the growing commotion around him. Unknown to Jake, his actions were being observed by more than just casual tourists. Palace security personnel were monitoring the situation from multiple vantage points, and they were in constant communication with the guards on duty. Every move Jake made was being carefully watched and evaluated. The morning was about to take a turn that Jake never could have anticipated. Jake decided to escalate his performance. He began telling elaborate stories to the guard, describing fake scenarios about aliens landing or zombies attacking London, all while maintaining eye contact with his phone camera. "This guy must be the most boring person alive," he announced loudly. "I bet he doesn't even have a personality under all that fancy dress-up costume." The crowd around them continued to grow, and Jake was loving every second of the attention. He noticed several people were now filming him instead of the guard, which only encouraged him further. This was exactly what he had hoped for, going viral in real time. "You know what? I think this guy might actually be a robot," Jake continued, walking in a circle around the guard while keeping his phone trained on both of them. "Like, seriously, who can stand this still for this long? It's not natural." Guardsman Williams remained motionless, but inside his mind, he was carefully cataloging every action Jake took. His training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings at all times, even when appearing to ignore them completely. He knew exactly where Jake was positioned, how close he was standing, and what the crowd was doing behind him. The guard had dealt with hundreds of tourists like Jake over the years. Some were merely curious, others were deliberately trying to cause disruption. Most eventually got bored and moved on when they realized they couldn't get a reaction. But Jake seemed different, more persistent and increasingly bold. Mark had positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, growing more uncomfortable by the minute. He pulled out his own phone, not to record Jake's antics, but to check if there were any nearby attractions they could visit instead. He was beginning to regret agreeing to come to London with his college friend. "Dude, people are staring at us like we're criminals," Mark called out. But Jake was too caught up in his performance to pay attention. Jake began making up stories about the guard's personal life, speaking directly to his camera. "I bet this guy goes home and practices standing still in his mirror. Probably has a boring girlfriend who he never talks to because he's forgotten how to speak." The crowd laughed at some of his jokes, which only fueled Jake's confidence. What Jake didn't realize was that his jokes were being heard not just by the tourists around him, but by the guard himself. Guardsman Williams was a real person with a real life, real feelings, and real relationships. He had a wife named Sarah whom he loved deeply, and a 6-year-old daughter named Emma who thought her daddy was the bravest man in the world. Williams thought about Emma as Jake continued his commentary. Every morning before leaving for duty, Emma would salute him and tell him to catch the bad guys. "Daddy." She was incredibly proud of his uniform and would often ask him to tell her stories about guarding the palace. The idea that someone would mock his service and dedication in front of crowds of people was beginning to test even his exceptional self-control. But Williams was a professional, and he had sworn an oath to maintain his post regardless of personal feelings. He focused on his breathing, on his posture, on the weight of his rifle, and on the responsibility he carried as a representative of the King's Guard. Jake, meanwhile, was growing frustrated by the complete lack of response. He had expected at least a twitch, a blink, something to show that the guard was human. The longer the guard remained motionless, the more determined Jake became to break through his composure. "This is actually getting weird now," Jake said to his phone. "Like, genuinely weird. Is this guy even alive?" He moved closer, now standing directly in front of the guard, their faces only about a foot apart. The crowd began to murmur with unease. Even those who had been enjoying Jake's performance were starting to feel that he was crossing a line. The elderly British woman who had spoken up earlier approached Mark. "Your friend needs to stop this immediately," she said firmly. "This is completely inappropriate behavior. That young man is a serving soldier, not entertainment." Mark nodded apologetically. "I know, I've been trying to get him to leave, but he won't listen to me." Jake had now been harassing the guard for over 20 minutes. His phone battery was running low, but he was determined to get some kind of reaction before ending his video. He began to consider what he could do next that might finally crack the guard's composure. "You know what, guys?" Jake said to his camera, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "I think it's time to really test this robot theory. Let's see what happens when I try to touch the famous uniform." Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Even those who didn't know the specific rules about the King's Guard understood that touching a soldier without permission was completely unacceptable. Mark pushed through the crowd, finally deciding he had to physically intervene. "Jake, don't even think about it," Mark said urgently, grabbing his friend's arm. "You'll probably get arrested or something." But Jake shook him off, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He was so close to creating the perfect viral moment. "Relax, what's the worst that could happen? He can't break character, right? That's the whole point of these guys." What Jake didn't understand was that he was about to cross a line that would change everything. The King's Guard weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active military personnel with the authority and training to protect themselves and their posts. And Guardsman Williams was about to remind Jake of that fact in a way he would never forget. The crowd held its collective breath as Jake reached out his hand toward the guard's red tunic, completely unaware that his morning was about to take a dramatic and unforgettable turn. The moment Jake's fingertips made contact with the red wool of the guard's tunic, everything changed in an instant. Guardsman Williams moved with lightning speed and precision that caught everyone completely off guard. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, brought his rifle across his body, and let out a thunderous roar that echoed across the entire courtyard. "Step back from the King's Guard!" The volume and authority in Williams's voice was absolutely shocking. Jake stumbled backward so quickly that he nearly fell over, his phone clattering to the ground as his hands flew up defensively. The entire crowd of tourists jumped, many letting out startled screams. Some people actually ran away, thinking something dangerous was happening. Jake's face went completely white as he stared up at the guard, who had suddenly transformed from a silent statue into an imposing military figure. William stood at his full height, his rifle positioned across his chest, his eyes now locked directly onto Jake with an intensity that was both professional and intimidating. "Sir, you are not permitted to touch the King's Guard or his equipment," Williams continued in a voice that commanded absolute attention. "Step back immediately and maintain your distance." The crowd had gone completely silent except for the sound of camera shutters clicking rapidly. Everyone wanted to capture this moment, but no one dared to get too close. Even the London traffic seemed quieter, as if the entire city was listening to what was happening in the palace courtyard. Jake opened his mouth to speak but found that no words came out. His usual confidence had evaporated completely. This wasn't the reaction he had expected at all. He had thought the guard would remain silent no matter what happened. But instead he was facing down a trained soldier who was clearly not amused by his antics. Mark rushed forward to grab Jake's phone from the ground, his own face red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," he said to the guard, though Williams had already returned to his original position, once again staring straight ahead. "We're really sorry. We'll leave right now." But Jake wasn't ready to leave. As the initial shock wore off, he began to feel embarrassed and defensive. All these people had just watched him get completely humiliated by the guard, and his phone had captured every second of it. Instead of the viral video he had imagined, he now had footage of himself being publicly scolded like a misbehaving child. "Seriously," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to regain his composure. "All I did was barely touch your costume, and you're going to yell at me like that. What's your problem, man?" The crowd began to murmur disapprovingly. Several people started telling Jake to leave the guard alone, but he was too caught up in his wounded pride to listen. He couldn't accept that his plan had backfired so completely. Williams remained at attention, but Jake could sense that the soldier was still very much aware of his presence. The guard's earlier outburst had proven that he was anything but a mindless robot, and Jake was beginning to realize that he might have seriously underestimated the situation. "This is ridiculous," Jake continued, his voice getting louder again. "You're supposed to be professional, right? That didn't seem very professional to me. That seemed pretty aggressive for someone who's supposed to be protecting tourists." An older gentleman in the crowd stepped forward. "Young man, I suggest you listen to the soldier and move along. You're making quite a spectacle of yourself." Jake spun around to face the man. "Mind your own business, Grandpa. This is between me and Robot Boy here." He gestured toward Williams, who continued to maintain his position. What Jake didn't realize was that his behavior was being closely monitored by palace security personnel who had been watching the entire interaction from the beginning. They had been in communication with the guards on duty, and they were growing increasingly concerned about Jake's escalating behavior and his refusal to respect the guard's authority. Mark grabbed Jake's arm again, this time more forcefully. "We're leaving. Now. Before you get us both arrested." But Jake pulled away from his friend, still stinging from the public embarrassment. No way. I'm not letting this guy think he scared me off. I have every right to be here. This is a public place. The crowd was becoming more agitated, with several people now openly telling Jake to show some respect and leave the guard alone. Children were asking their parents what was happening, and many families were deciding to move to other areas of the palace grounds to avoid the confrontation. Jake retrieved his phone from Mark and started recording again, though his hands were noticeably shaking. Okay guys, so apparently these guards can talk when they want to. Who knew? But I'm not backing down from some guy in a fancy hat who thinks he can intimidate people. Guardsman Williams could hear every word Jake was saying, and he was carefully evaluating the situation. His training had taught him when and how to respond to various types of threats and disruptions. Jake's behavior was becoming increasingly problematic, and Williams was preparing for the possibility that he might need to take further action. The morning air was tense with anticipation as tourists continued to gather around the unfolding drama. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone could sense that the situation was far from over. Jake was about to learn that there were consequences for disrespecting the king's guard, and those consequences were about to become very real indeed. William stood ready, his years of training and experience guiding his every decision. Jake had no idea how much trouble he was actually in, or how dramatically his London vacation was about to change. Jake made what would prove to be the biggest mistake of his entire trip. Fueled by embarrassment and determination to save face in front of the crowd, he stepped forward again toward the guard. You know what? I'm not intimidated by your little outburst. You can't tell me where I can and can't stand in a public place. This time, Guardsman Williams didn't just shout. He stepped forward with the precise, powerful movements of a trained soldier and positioned his rifle directly in front of Jake's chest, creating an unmistakable barrier between them. The bayonet at the end of the rifle gleamed in the morning sunlight, and Williams's voice cut through the air like a blade. Make way for the king's guard. The command was so loud and authoritative that several tourists instinctively stepped backward. Williams began marching forward with slow, deliberate steps, forcing Jake to retreat. Each step was perfectly measured, each movement calculated to demonstrate absolute control and authority. Jake found himself backing up rapidly, his eyes fixed on the rifle that was now pointing directly at him. The confidence he had felt just moments before completely evaporated as he realized he was facing a real soldier, with real authority and real training. This wasn't a theme park employee or a street performer. This was a member of the British military. Whoa, okay, Jake stammered, his hands raised in front of him. I'm backing up. But Williams continued his advance, his voice booming across the courtyard.
Stand clear!
Make way. The crowd of tourists scattered like leaves in the wind. Parents grabbed their children and moved them to safety, while other visitors backed away from the confrontation. The entire atmosphere had shifted from curious entertainment to serious concern for everyone's safety. Mark was frantically waving at Jake from the edge of the crowd. Just run, dude. Just run. But Jake was too shocked to think clearly. He continued backing up, stumbling over his own feet as Williams maintained his steady advance. The guard's movements were so precise and intimidating that Jake felt like he was being pursued by a military machine rather than a human being. I'm not doing anything wrong, Jake called out desperately, his voice cracking with panic. This is crazy. You can't do this to tourists. Williams' response was to continue marching forward, his rifle held steady, his eyes locked onto Jake with unwavering focus. Every step communicated a clear message: respect the authority of the king's guard or face the consequences. Jake's phone was still recording, but now instead of capturing what he thought would be a funny video of him annoying a guard, it was documenting his complete humiliation and retreat. His followers would see him being systematically backed down by a soldier who had transformed from statue to formidable military presence in a matter of seconds. The elderly British woman who had criticized Jake earlier was now watching with satisfaction. About time someone taught that young man some manners, she muttered to her husband. Other tourists were pulling out their phones to record the spectacle, but many were keeping their distance. Nobody wanted to risk becoming Williams' next target if they got too close to the action. Jake continued backing up until he found himself pressed against the palace railings, with nowhere else to retreat. Williams stopped his advance just a few feet away, his rifle still positioned between them. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the trained soldier maintaining his professional composure, and the tourist breathing heavily with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. "Sir," Williams said in a voice that was quieter but no less commanding, "you will maintain a respectful distance from the King's Guard at all times. Any further interference with my duties will result in your immediate removal from the premises." Jake nodded quickly, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. The authority in Williams's tone made it absolutely clear that this was not a request or a suggestion. It was an order from a representative of the British Crown. Williams held his position for another few seconds, ensuring that his message had been completely understood, then executed a perfect about-face and marched back to his original post. Within moments, he had resumed his statue-like stance, rifle at attention, eyes fixed straight ahead as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The crowd that had gathered to watch Jake's antics was now looking at him with a mixture of disapproval and pity. His attempt to humiliate the guard had completely backfired, and he had become the object of ridicule instead. Jake stood against the railings for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. His heart was still racing and his hands were shaking as he looked down at his phone. The entire confrontation had been recorded, but not in the way he had planned. Mark finally approached him cautiously. "Are you okay? That was intense, man." Jake looked around at the crowd, many of whom were still staring at him and whispering among themselves. Children were pointing at him and asking their parents questions. He had wanted attention, but not this kind of attention. "Let's get out of here," Jake said quietly, his earlier bravado completely gone. But as they started to walk away, Jake realized that his London adventure was far from over. Unknown to him, Palace security had been recording everything, and his actions had triggered protocols that would soon bring even more serious consequences than a public humiliation. Jake and Mark had barely made it 50 yards from the guard post when they were approached by two men in dark suits. The men walked with the confident stride of law enforcement, and Jake's stomach dropped as he realized they were heading directly toward him. "Excuse me, sir," the taller of the two men said, showing a badge that identified him as Palace security. "I'm Officer Thompson, and this is Officer Davies. We need to speak with you about your interaction with the King's Guard." Jake's mouth went dry. "What? Why? I didn't do anything illegal. I was just taking some pictures and videos like every other tourist here." Officer Davies stepped forward, his expression serious but professional. "Sir, we have video footage of you physically touching the guard and refusing to comply with his lawful orders. This constitutes interference with a member of the armed forces in the execution of his duties." "That's insane," Jake protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "All I did was barely touch his costume, and he's the one who got aggressive with me." Mark grabbed Jake's arm, whispering urgently, "Dude, just cooperate. Don't make this worse than it already is." Officer Thompson consulted a small notebook. "Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison. Mr. Morrison, you've been observed harassing Guardsman Williams for approximately 30 minutes. You were warned multiple times by other visitors to cease your behavior, and you chose to escalate the situation by making physical contact with a serving member of the military." Jake looked around frantically, hoping to see other tourists who might support his version of events. But most people were deliberately avoiding eye contact with him. A few were still recording with their phones from a distance, clearly more interested in documenting his arrest than helping him. "Look, I'm an American tourist, okay? I didn't know there were special rules about touching. Nobody told me I couldn't do that. Isn't this supposed to be a free country?" Officer Davies almost smiled at that comment. "Mr. Morrison, ignorance of the law is not a defense. The King's Guard are active military personnel, not tourist attractions. Interfering with their duties is a serious offense under British law." As the officers spoke, Jake noticed that a small crowd was beginning to gather around them, drawn by the sight of what appeared to be an arrest in progress. He could hear whispered conversations and see people pointing in his direction. This was exactly the kind of attention he had wanted to avoid. "What happens now?" Mark asked nervously. "Are you arresting him?" Officer Thompson shook his head. "Not at this time. However, Mr. Morrison, you are being issued a formal warning and banned from the palace grounds for the remainder of your visit to London. Any attempt to return will result in immediate arrest for trespassing." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. followed immediately by embarrassment. Being banned from Buckingham Palace wasn't exactly how he had planned to spend his vacation, but it was certainly better than being arrested. Additionally, Officer Davies continued, we strongly advise you to delete any video footage you recorded during your harassment of the guard. Delete it? Jake's relief quickly turned to indignation. You can't make me do that. That's my property, and I have the right to record in public places. The officers exchanged a look. You're correct that we cannot legally force you to delete the footage, Officer Thompson admitted. However, posting videos that show you committing offenses against British military personnel could result in additional charges and complications with your visa status. Jake had never considered that his video could cause problems with his ability to stay in the country or travel internationally in the future. The whole situation was spiraling far beyond what he had anticipated when he started filming that morning. Mark pulled Jake aside while the officers waited patiently. Just delete the stupid video, man. It's not worth it. You look terrible in it anyway. But Jake was torn. The video represented hours of work and potentially thousands of views on his social media accounts. His followers expected him to post regular content, and this was supposed to be the highlight of his London trip. I need to think about it, Jake told the officers. Officer Davies handed him a card. This contains information about the incident report we'll be filing. If you choose to post the video, you should be aware that it will be evidence of your misconduct and could be used against you in future legal proceedings. As the officers walked away, Jake stood in the middle of the palace courtyard feeling completely defeated. His morning had started with such promise, and now he was banned from one of London's most famous attractions with the threat of legal consequences hanging over his head. Mark shook his head in frustration. I can't believe you got us banned from Buckingham Palace. My girlfriend is going to kill me when she finds out we can't see the changing of the guard ceremony. Jake looked back toward where Guardsman Williams still stood at his post, once again appearing completely motionless and professional. From this distance, it was hard to believe that the same man had just systematically humiliated him in front of dozens of tourists. Other visitors were giving Jake a wide berth as he and Mark made their way toward the palace gates. Word of his confrontation with the guard had apparently spread, and people were pointing and whispering as he passed. He had definitely achieved his goal of getting attention, but not the kind he had wanted. As they reached the street outside the palace, Jake realized that his problems were far from over. He still had to decide what to do with the video, and he was beginning to understand that his actions might have consequences he had never imagined. 2 days later, Jake sat in his London hotel room staring at his phone screen. The video of his confrontation with Guardsman Williams had been uploaded to his social media accounts the previous evening, despite Mark's repeated warnings not to post it. Jake had convinced himself that people would see the humor in the situation and sympathize with him as a confused tourist who had been treated unfairly. He was completely wrong. The video had indeed gone viral, but not in the way Jake had hoped. Instead of supporting him, viewers were overwhelmingly critical of his behavior. The comment section was filled with people calling him disrespectful, entitled, and embarrassing to Americans abroad. British viewers were particularly harsh, explaining in detail why his actions were considered deeply offensive. This idiot clearly has no respect for our military, read one comment that had received thousands of likes. The King's Guard are real soldiers who deserve better than this childish harassment. Another popular comment stated, Imagine being so desperate for social media attention that you'd humiliate yourself like this in front of the world. The guard showed remarkable restraint. Jake's follower count, which he had hoped would increase dramatically, was actually dropping as people unfollowed him in disgust. Several of his sponsors had already contacted him expressing concern about being associated with the video, and one had already terminated their partnership. Mark knocked on the hotel room door. Jake, we need to talk. Jake reluctantly let his friend into the room. Mark's expression was serious as he sat down on the bed opposite Jake. I just got off the phone with my dad, Mark said. He's a lawyer, remember? He looked into this whole situation and you could be in real trouble. Jake's stomach lurched. What kind of trouble? The British authorities take harassment of military personnel very seriously. Dad says the fact that you posted the video online actually makes things worse because it shows you have no remorse for what you did. He thinks they might pursue charges after all. Jake felt panic rising in his chest. But the officer said I was just getting a warning. That was before you decided to broadcast your misconduct to the entire world, Mark replied. Dad says posting the video could be seen as an attempt to further humiliate the guard and undermine respect for the military. Jake looked at his phone again, scrolling through the endless stream of negative comments. People were sharing the video with captions like, "How not to behave as a tourist," and "American embarrasses himself at Buckingham Palace." Several news outlets had picked up the story, describing it as an example of disrespectful tourist behavior. "There's more," Mark continued. "Some people online have figured out your real name and started contacting your employer back home. Apparently, your company is getting phone calls and emails from people complaining about your behavior." Jake's job as a marketing coordinator for a small tech company suddenly felt very precarious. His boss had always been supportive of his social media activities, but this level of negative attention was exactly what employers feared when their staff became internet famous for the wrong reasons. "What should I do?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark handed him a printed email. "Dad wrote this for you. It's a formal apology that you should send to the palace and post on your social media accounts. He also strongly recommends that you delete the original video immediately." Jake read through the apology, which acknowledged his disrespectful behavior and expressed genuine remorse for his actions. It was humble and sincere, but posting it would mean admitting that he had been completely wrong about everything. "If I post this, I'll look like a complete fool," Jake said. "You already look like a complete fool," Mark replied bluntly. "The question is whether you want to be a fool who learns from his mistakes or a fool who makes everything worse." That evening, Jake made the difficult decision to post the apology. He also deleted the original video, though by then it had been downloaded and shared so many times that copies would likely exist forever on the internet. The apology received a mixed response. While some people appreciated his willingness to admit he was wrong, others felt it was too little, too late. The damage to his reputation had already been done. 3 weeks after returning to the United States, Jake received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a letter from Guardsman Williams, along with a small informational booklet about the history and traditions of the King's Guard. The letter was brief, but thoughtful. Williams explained that he had served in Afghanistan before joining the King's Guard, and that his military service was something he took great pride in. He wrote that he hoped Jake would take the time to learn about the real history and sacrifice behind the uniform, rather than seeing it as a costume or entertainment. The King's Guard represents centuries of British military tradition and the brave men and women who have served our country, Williams wrote. "I hope your experience will help you understand that respect is something that should be given freely, not something that needs to be earned through confrontation." Jake read the letter several times, feeling a deep sense of shame about his behavior. He had never considered that the guard was a real person with real feelings and a real service record. He had been so focused on creating content for his followers that he had completely dehumanized the man he was harassing. 6 months later, Jake's social media following had largely recovered, but his content had changed significantly. Instead of pranks and boundary-pushing stunts, he focused on educational travel content that showed respect for local cultures and traditions. He had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between entertainment and harassment, and about the real consequences of disrespectful behavior. The video of his encounter with Guardsman Williams still surfaced occasionally, usually as an example of how not to behave as a tourist. Each time Jake saw it shared, he was reminded of the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. Regardless of whether cameras were rolling, Guardsman Williams continued his service with the King's Guard, protecting the royal family and upholding the traditions he held dear. He never forgot the American tourist who had learned such an important lesson that day, and he hoped that Jake's experience would serve as a warning to others about the importance of showing proper respect to those who serve.